Hello, good morning. It is the 11th of March today, and it's quite early here in the UK. It's just gone 5 a.m. in the morning. So I can only apologise that when I'm actually uploading my videos onto YouTube or sharing them on my blogs, that I am a little bit a day behind doing so. But unfortunately, that's just the way things have digressed with me looking after my children, and also because of the time differentiation in different countries. Now, I am for Lent this year, 2022, reading the After series collection by Todd. Now, if no one's ever heard of it or they're not familiar with it, if I just quickly grab the first book, I've left the other one upstairs and I don't really want to wake my little one up getting it. This is kind of what the book looks like. It may be different on the cover since it's now a movie after selling 11 million copies. I just wanted to take a minute to basically... I don't really know how to put this, to be honest. It's a bit complicated. But maybe it's a little bit of frustration, because when you are in education within the UK, we have a thing called the national curriculum. And so the UK meaning the United Kingdom. And it differentiates depending on whether or not you live in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales. Yes, they're all part of the United Kingdom, but they all have their different way of teaching. So they don't stick to the same sort of educational syllabus. The same if you were educated abroad in somewhere like the US of A. Now, what I have found in a lot of books that are published by American authors, such as Todd, is that they forget that when they are actually trying to aim their books at a certain demographic or a certain age group, that not everybody is going to know or understand when they talk about a certain book or a certain movie or a series or even a place in the world, that not everybody is going to be educated to the same standard. So, in the first book, Pride and Prejudice is mentioned, Wuthering Heights is mentioned, and Great Expectations is mentioned. So you would think that regardless of wherever you live in the world, you would know what those books are, you would have some concept or some idea as to who they were published by, who the authors were, and a little bit about the backstory. Newsflash, that is not the case. We in the United Kingdom do not study British literature. We do not study British authors as part of our upbringing. The only one that we have really ever been forced to study is Shakespeare. So if you are going to compare your book to any other book, I do not understand why they always use Jane Austen. I can't understand why they always use the Bronte sisters either. So in book 2, they've mentioned Northanger Abbey. Now, I would say that I'm quite a well-educated, rounded person. I mean, I'm 40 years old almost. But I only know that Northanger Abbey is written by Jane Austen because I watched a movie called Jane Austen Book Club, which stars, I believe, is it Faye Dunaway, isn't it? Not Faye Dunaway. I'm going to say Faye Dunaway. She's like ancient now. Anyway, the cast that are in it, they're not very well known. They're not a very well established sort of cast. They're a cast of like mature actresses who are mostly, I believe, American, or if they're not, they live in America. And they spend a year... Oh, I know who's in it. Oh gosh, I've forgotten her name. She's a really well-known actress as well, and I've forgotten her name. It'll probably come to me in a minute. She is in Girl on Train. That might help. And they spend a year of their life reading Jane Austen books. So they read Northanger Abbey, they read Pride and Prejudice, they read Persuasion. Again, I've only ever heard of Persuasion because it's in the movie The Lake House with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. So if you are going to put books that are real in the book that you are publishing, please do your research first. And don't assume that everybody is going to know who these authors are or the movies you use. Like you mentioned the movie about, again, I'll go back to it, you mentioned the movie The Vow. Not everybody's going to have heard of that movie. You mentioned the movie where Tom Hanks falls in love with Meg Ryan. You've Got Mail is the most up-to-date version of Sleepless in Seattle. Yes, I can understand why you've talked about Sleepless in Seattle, because Seattle is where Tessa, your main leading lady in the book, wants to work. It's where she wants to work at the publishing house of Fount Publishing once it gets established. So, and she's into what they call the classics. She even mentions Ernest Hemingway, and again, I know who Ernest Hemingway is. I know who he is because I've watched movies like 10 Things I Like to Hate About You, which is based on a Shakespeare adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew. Okay, I know The Taming of the Shrew because I love Shakespeare. But again, if you were going to do a classic Shakespeare play, you would have probably picked something like Romeo and Juliet or the Scottish play or Hamlet. Which are maybe the 3 key Shakespeare plays that people are aware of. And so I knew a little bit about Ernest Hemingway. I knew that he fought in the war. I knew that he became an author. I knew that I didn't know he lived in Paris, but I knew that he was aware of who Picasso was. I watched the movie, which was mildly based on his life, which included Sandra Bullock when she was younger, where he has this kind of relationship with a nurse in Love and War, with a nurse during the war when he is fighting. But he, like most people who turn to being a writer in their lives, had a very tragic life. I think he got married a bunch of times, got divorced a bunch of times. He became an alcoholic. A lot of authors, especially child authors, they seem to have this very dark side to their upbringing or to their life. I mean, even A. Milne, who wrote Christopher Robin, he was in the First World War. He suffered with shell shock, which we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He wrote this book about his son, and the amount of resentment there was between father and son, because his son didn't want his father to write this book about his life. He wanted him to be the father he always wanted him to be. He didn't get on with his mother, and in later years, Christopher Robin, who wasn't known by his friends as Christopher, but was called Billy Moon by his father and mother, and his father was known as Blue. He ended up having a daughter, I believe, had cerebral palsy, and he himself ended up getting some sort of motor neurons disease in later life. but he resented his parents so much for his childhood upbringing that he never wanted to be affiliated with the books Winnie the Pooh or anything to do with Christopher Robin. So, and even authors like the author of Noddy, who I know Helena Bonham Carter played in a movie about her life. I am trying to think of the name, but I've drawn a blank again. She wasn't a nice person. She had children, but she wasn't a nice mother. And again, Swallows and Amazons. The book was changed again. The name Titty was changed to like Hattie or Tatty or something ridiculous, instead of using the proper name of the girl. The author of Swallows and Amazons, they based that book on somebody they knew. I think it was their own daughter even. So if you are, as an author, even I've had to think about this myself. In the book that I'm writing, I've done a lot of research. It's took me 20 years. And I've put things in my book that people aren't always going to know about. They aren't. But then I've put things in there where my character, Catherine, she's an avid book reader. She's an avid book collector. So she has a lot of first editions of books that cost thousands and thousands of pounds, even millions of pounds. You do not own these books, okay, unless you've got the money to buy them. She collects whiskey. Again, some whiskies that are produced are really expensive. They're not the sort of thing you would go around drinking. You know, you collect them. And one of the movies I also seen recently was Old Guard. And in that movie, Old Guard, again, it was a fantastic movie. I really enjoyed it, and I hope they make the second one soon, if they haven't already. But in that movie, one of the main characters, pardon me, she is given a first edition of the book The Count of Monte Cristo. Not The Count of Monte Cristo, sorry. But again, if you were given a first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo, it'd be a lot of money. She is given a first edition book of Don Quixote. Now, Don Quixote is a book that I believe was written by a Spanish author. I forget the name of the author. But I've always known the story of Don Quixote because it's been mentioned in a number of films in the past. And it's one of those books that is written about a man who obviously has a mental illness. He's old. He's probably got Alzheimer's. And he has a friend who takes care of him, a bit like his nurse. And they go around, and he thinks that he's this knight. And he's galloping around on, like, what he thinks is a horse. And I believe it's not a horse, it's a pony. Not a pony, sorry, a donkey. And he's fighting windmills, and he lives like in this fantasy world. And that's about all I know about the book. But it's kind of sweet in a way that I'm not saying it's nice to have Alzheimer's, don't get me wrong. I've worked with people with Alzheimer's and dementia. It is heart-rending. And out of all the health problems people could probably end up with, a motor neurons disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, any illness or disability that affects your body or your mind that you no longer have control over them, I would never wish them on anyone. I wouldn't even wish them on my worst enemy. And but in a way, it's strange how the mind works. Most people that I have cared for with Alzheimer's and dementia, they seem to go back to a time where they were happy. They seem to regress back to, it's like the brain, although it's slowly shutting down, and you're forgetting how to do the basics, and you're becoming like a child again in some cases. Most people that I know with this condition, or have cared for with this condition, it's like they go back to being a child all over again. And they sort of, the mind, I suppose, sort of hangs on to certain memories. And you just sort of relive them daily. I mean, but what is sad is that people with this condition, the one thing they lose is their family. Because they no longer know who they are. And that is sad. That is so sad that happens. And, my dad himself, when he was dying, he didn't know who I was. And my dad didn't have Alzheimer's, didn't have dementia. My dad had brain tumour. And he didn't know who I was. And to stand there in front of somebody that you know and you love and you care for, and them not know who you are, it's terrible. And I always remember saying to my dad before he died that I'd take him to Paris. He'd never been. And Paris was one of those places that, although I'd been a few times, I didn't grow to love or appreciate until adulthood. And it's one of those places I would have loved to have took him before he died. And I talked to him about it before he passed away, telling him where I'd take him and telling him what I loved about Paris. But that never happened. So anyway, I'm digressing. So if you are going to include things in a book that you are writing, please think of the demographic that you are aiming at. Please think about, if you're going to put a book in there like Northanger Abbey, I know it might sound stupid or patronising. I mean, one of my friends who's been reading my book, she keeps saying, take all your footnotes out. Don't leave them in. They don't need to be there. And I'm like, yes, they do need to be there. Because people aren't going to know stuff. And I've put them in, not because I think people are stupid, or because I'm being condescending or patronising or anything. It's like, in my book, I include the author, J.R. Tolkien. And if you don't know who J.R. Tolkien is, then I'll explain quickly. J.R. Tolkien is the author of The Lord of the Rings. So in my book's based in South Africa, and J.R. Tolkien was actually born in South Africa. So my character, who loves Lord of the Rings, I don't go into any details about the books, but one of the things she always promised herself that she would do is pay like a pilgrimage to J.R. Tolkien and go to his hometown where he was born. And so I explain this in my book, and I do a bit of a backstory of where he was born in the book. And I explain the history of the place and how the name has changed, how it used to be known as like the Orange State. And she's like, you don't need to put that in, that's not relevant. And I'm like, but it is relevant, because it's relevant to me, it's relevant to the character. So I've left it in. Pardon me. So I'm yawning away, so I'm going to end it here now. So yes, it's the only sort of criticism I think I have. I'm probably done quite a lot of criticism, or constructive criticism, when I've been talking about the books and the movies and how they differentiate. But I'm on a lot of forums, and people always ask the question, to be a good writer, do I need to read other people's work? And I'm like, well, no, not really, because write what you want to write what you love. People are either going to love it or they're going to hate it. But it does help to be a little bit educated and sort of, I don't want to say learn by other people's mistakes or learn by other authors' mistakes, but bear in mind that if you are going to write something, make sure that you clearly and concisely know who your demographic's going to be, who you are writing for. And if you think for any minute, oh, hang on a minute, maybe someone who isn't in that demographic might pick up this book, might choose to read it, are they going to understand? It's like recently, I don't always watch The Apprentice. It's a programme on the UK TV. I don't know whether it's aired anywhere else. And it's got Sir Alan Sugar in. I actually, a little bit of information about myself. I actually did audition for The Apprentice a few years back, before I was a mother. I didn't even make the first cut, so it's really hard to get on that programme. And at the same time, when people do get on it, you think, why on earth are these people on there? They're complete idiots. But as we know, it's a reality TV show, and they've picked the biggest idiots sometimes to be on there, and not people that actually know what they're doing. And one of the things they had to do was create a cruise for a certain demographic. And one of the girls, they decide to use the word borgy cruises. And not everybody's going to know what that word is. Okay, I don't know what that word is. I still don't know what that word is. I even tried researching it on the internet, and I still couldn't really understand what borgy was. And even Sir Alan Sugar didn't know what that word was. It's one of these words that's kind of like, is a bit of a fad that, people use within a certain age group or within a certain clique. So if you don't really know this word, it doesn't mean you're uneducated. It just means that at the time this word was invented, only a certain group of people knew what it meant. Like chav. I mean, we've heard the words, most people know what a chav is. And again, I know in the remakes, not the remakes, sorry, in Doctor Who, Billie Piper, in the first series of Doctor Who that she's in, she's supposed to be in the future, and the first thing she says is, "Oh my god, I'm a chav!" Okay, 21st century, 20th century, 19th century, possibly, 20th century sort of people are going to know what a chav is. Okay, anyone born sort of, I'd say after 1995, for argument's sake, I've just picked a date out of the air, are going to know what a chav is. But would someone know what a chav is in the year 2000? Not 2000, sorry. We're already gone past the thousands. We're only in the millennium. But like a billion years' time from now, unless they've been taught it in school. Or, it's not a word you would have used 1,000 years ago. And again, one of the things that I looked at and researched was words that have been used, or references that have been used in Outlander. Because what you've got to realise is Claire in Outlander, if you don't already know what Outlander's about, it's about time travel. So Claire, the leading lady in Outlander, she is from the future. And then there was also Gaelis Duncan. Gaelis, she was from the future as well. So when Claire and Gaelis were together, they would use references around one another that they would have known from their time. So like they use a reference from Casablanca. Again, I've never seen the movie Casablanca, and it's something like, in all the gin bars in all the world, you had to walk into mine. And she says to her, "Why are you following me, Claire? Why are you here?" Because she doesn't know that she's a time traveller. And again, that's not something somebody is going to know from the 18th century, which I believe is where Outlander is set. It's set just after, before the Battle of Culloden in Scotland, and then after the Battle of Culloden, like 20 years later. And then it's talking about the American Revolution and, and historical things. So again, there's going to be certain things in the book that the author would have said, "Whoa, hang on a minute, I can't put that in," because people in that era wouldn't have known that language. They wouldn't have known those words. And I believe, if I remember rightly, the way Claire actually finds Jamie is that he writes a passage in a piece of propaganda, because he's a papist, so he's a Catholic, that Claire comes across, or it's not Claire who comes across it, sorry. It's one of the other characters who comes across it. And he writes, I believe it's Wordsworth is who he uses. He uses some famous quote from a poet that back then wouldn't have been known because that poet did not exist. So when this piece of propaganda information gets found, because it is found in historical documents, he actually says to Claire, did you ever speak to Jamie about the following? And she's like, yes, I did. I quoted this famous saying from this poet. And he says, because it's already been published. But how could this have been published before it had already been written? And that's how she manages to find him and knows he's still alive. So it's a bit like a calling card for her, that he thinks to himself, okay, if Claire is ever going to come back to be with me in my time, how do I tell her that I'm alive? And he does this by writing something that only someone from her time would have known. So anyway, enough about that. I'm going on about Outlander, and yet it's the After trilogy, it's the After collection that I'm reading. But I tend to do this a lot on my blogs, and I tend to digress, and I do apologise. So I will continue with the After collection. I'm on chapter 19 right now, and I will aim to read all of the books within 40 days and 40 nights. So I'm aiming to do the last one before the end of Lent. So thank you so much for listening to me. This has probably been the longest video that I've done in a while. So thank you once again, and please bear with me. If you don't want to watch what I'm writing,